What does it mean to be one? Is it to be a single individual that exists throughout physical time and space, taking form as a complex series of bodily functions and mental occurrences which are all wrapped up in a little package we call you? There are many things that constitute to that package, of course, the human experience, have you? But when taking into consideration our individual yet limited human perception as it relates to the scale in which we live in relationship to everything else in existence, it can be easy to be satisfied with the notion that we exist as one person. But if we investigate the notion of oneness by taking a deeper look at our language and our physical, social, historical, legal, and even our personal existences, maybe you'll find that being just one, and subsequently one person, is not as apparent as it may seem. So, let's investigate. Now, the most important step to be able to tackle a question such as this is to establish and understand the definitions of the words we are using, particularly the word one and the word person. For now. Using definitions from 3 different dictionary resources, the word one in the context of quantity can be defined as being or amounting to a single unit or individual or entire thing, item or object rather than 2 or more, a single, being a single unit or thing, and just one as opposed to any more or to none at all, single. Now, a major thing to take into consideration when looking at these definitions is the fact that something can be one as a whole and one as a segment of a whole at the same time. What matters is if the word we are looking at, in this case person, can be identified as itself when describing different aspects of the human experience. Fortunately, that appears to be the case. Some notable definitions to the word person, again using 3 different dictionary resources, are an individual's body, a human being regarded as an individual, the personality of a human being, one that is recognized by law as a subject of rights and duties, and the actual self or individual personality of a human being. The words one and person have many definitions that within themselves validate that your personhood is not merely limited to your body, but is also able to be recognized through multiple contexts. Of course, that doesn't mean you live your life through multiple bodies at the same time, but it does raise some questions over the oneness of personhood that I think would be worth looking into. So let's look at the rest of these previously mentioned categories, and let you be the judge. First off, your physical existence. When you think of your physical existence within the context of your body, it can be easy to see yourself as strictly one. You only have one physical body that you're born with. Of course, you could think about this as one unit of person within itself. But even your own physical existence involves occurrences which question whether that oneness can be broken up into multiple segments of ones as well. You may have heard of the thought experiment known as the ship of Theseus. In short, it brought rise to a discussion over if you built a boat and then slowly replaced each piece of the boat with a new piece. If all or just about all the pieces have been replaced, is it truly the same boat? If we look at humans, we actually experience something similar, as do most living things. The human body is made up of 7 times 10 to the power of 27 atoms. There are numerous projections that suggest that from within the time span of 1 year to 10 years, just about all the atoms in your body have been replaced. Though, not all of them. Particularly, some atoms within your teeth and within your brain appear to never be replaced. Going off that, being that the adult human's body is made up of between 50 to 60% water, most of that is actually replaced within the time span of about 16 days. Almost 65% of you is almost completely replaced twice a month. If your physical body within itself is one definition of person, one could identify the continual existence of your body as one. But one can make a strong case that every time almost all the atoms in your body have been replaced, these new yous could be identified as an individual person at a time as well. That said, you also have the added layer that many of the cells within your body die off and are replaced. Though not all and not at the same rate. A skin cell is replaced just about every few weeks. Many of the cells that line your digestive tract live less than a week before they are replaced. And some of the cells within your brain can last decades and even a literal lifetime before they die. Your body is constantly shedding and replacing material from an atomic to a microscopic level. And with that, it doesn't seem inappropriate to suggest that each time your body has been almost completely replaced, you are physically a different person. Of course, I could go on. Like if you received an organ via transplant from someone, are you technically more than one person in that way? But for the sake of time, let's look at a different perspective. All the world is a stage and the men and women are merely players. That's some good cliche right there. Person comes from persona, the Latin word for a theatrical mask. Persona is the aspect of someone's character that is presented to or perceived by others. If you have more than one persona, are you more than one person? Think about it, there's a good chance that the way you interact with your parents, your coworkers, your best friends, your romantic interests, and even random people you meet online is different from one another. At least to some degree. The way you behave around people you interact with will shape the way they perceive you from the outside. That is, your personality can be understood differently depending on the characteristics and qualities that other people come to understand you for. Thus, with each person you interact with's understanding of your personality, they may see a unique persona from one another. Now, the circumstances around this example are extremely real, especially if you look at extreme examples that don't necessarily concern yourself. A notable example would be the public perception of then 2016 presidential candidates Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. These two people definitely have personalities that solely exist within their heads. But public perception of these two candidates' personalities were extremely polarized and frequently conflicting. Both Clinton and Trump had large groups of people that saw them as either one of the best people you could possibly ask for the job, or literally one of the worst. Personas that were constructed around these individuals that were not necessarily genuine reflections of the people they actually were. But nonetheless, at least two opposing personas for each candidate that were developed, accepted, and maintained by large numbers of people. No doubt, if you were to take the perceived personalities of just one of these candidates and put them side by side to compare, you would think they were an entirely different person from themselves. More extreme would be the cult of personality that some nations develop around their leaders, regardless of how genuine it is. Arguably the best contemporary example would be the Kim family from North Korea. The enormous amount of propaganda that the North Korean government creates in order to make Kim Jong-un look like an idealized heroic person who is saving North Korea from genuine danger is quite intense. Regardless of how effective it is on the North Korean public, there are essentially two personas of this man. One that the propaganda creates and one that exists behind closed doors. Is he more than one person? And this plays at the last point I want to address for our social existence, the power of lying. The act of lying can completely shape a person's understanding over who you really are. Sometimes a small lie can make people not trust you and assume you're a liar all the time, and sometimes people find themselves having to commit to the lies they make, through acts that justify insincere qualities and characteristics over who they are. Maybe that's why people like that are often called two-faced. Now for your historical existence. A historical existence might seem like a weird concept, but it actually plays off of your social existence from the time you are dead on. How will the persona that people associate with you while you are alive differ from the one that people will associate with you when you are dead? Let's look at two examples. Dutch post-impressionist painter Vincent van Gogh, and British television and radio personality Jimmy Savile. In his life, Vincent van Gogh was considered a madman, a relative failure with a reckless artistic style. He would die in poverty, only achieving small amounts of success before his death. It would be only a few decades after his death that he would be perceived as one of the greatest painters in the history of Western society. His memory painted him as a misunderstood genius, while in his lifetime he was understood quite differently by most people. On the other hand, Jimmy Savile was a widely beloved television and radio personality in the United Kingdom, having shows that particularly focused around children. He was also known for fundraising millions of pounds for charity. Though the dark truth of Savile would be released not long after his death, that he was a child predator with hundreds of victims. His entire reputation destroyed, though unfortunately after his death. The people that these individuals are now seen as is radically different than what the mass majority of people saw them as during their lifetimes. The public has had a perspective shift, one going from tasteless to a genius, and the other going from a hero to a monster. Are the radical shifts in public perception concerning the qualities and characteristics of these two people something that shows two separate personas, based on a public understanding of their personalities? Going even further, what if the memory of someone changes, becoming propaganda or a legend that takes on a life of its own? Two more examples being Scottish hero William Wallace and the British King Arthur. The tale of William Wallace involves a man who fought in the Scottish Wars of Independence in the late 1200s. Initially successful, he would later be betrayed and given to the English. His story was adapted into an epic poem in the 1400s by a man of the name Blind Harry. It was a political piece that was meant to discourage cooperation between the Scottish king and the English. And that happened, so it may have been somewhat successful. Over the centuries, people had the story altered with almost each publication, including a wife here, a noble reason there, making a bad idea look good, and changing around who actually betrayed Wallace. Is the actual William Wallace more than one person at this point if his legend is so different from his actual life? More dramatic is the legend of King Arthur, the Breton king who fought off the Saxons. Many of the notable elements of the legend of King Arthur as we know it today is a Monmouth, a Welshman, and a French creation. The original legend was preserved by the Welsh starting around the year 800, about 300 years after Arthur supposedly lived. Monmouth in the French over the course of about 300 years, from 1100 to 1300, included multiple new elements. Arthur's relationship with Guinevere herself, the Holy Grail, Lancelot, Merlin, Excalibur to some degree, and a much greater focus on romance and knightly chivalry. The Arthur that we know today isn't much like some of the oldest Arthur legends. And it's hard to tell how much of even that is a genuine reflection of the original Arthur, let alone if he was even real. Do these constructed multiple personalities of William Wallace and King Arthur make them more than one person? The fact and the legend. Lastly, and on a completely different note, and bear with me, you also have the notion of interacting with people from the beyond. Regardless of the legitimacy of ghosts, the implications concerning the behavior of people while they are dead is important to take into consideration, especially if it changes the perception of the person. Maybe they were nice in life and now they are a mean ghost. Maybe a medium is telling us new information about a person. If a whole new persona is created through the notion that the dead are interacting with us, how do we treat that? Especially if people believe it. Of course, there are many different kinds of historical existences. The person who you are today, is that how you're going to be remembered when you die? Where the only way for you to interact with the world around us is by whatever information was preserved before you left it. Now for our legal existence. Our legal existence is quite expansive. This is basically how legal and even political institutions validate our existence, who we are or not, and even how you might work around it, though most of these are quite situational. There are quite a number of widely different examples. For instance, the census. Oh fun. Here I have an interesting personal story. For almost all my life, my parents have been divorced, and I would go back to the other parent's house at the end of each week. That said, when it came time for the census, both of my parents unknowingly from each other recorded me as a member of their household. In other words, I was entered into the American census twice, and on two separate occasions. So technically, I'm counting as more than one person in the 2000 and the 2010 censuses. With such a large number of divorced households in America, and potentially around the world as well, it would be interesting if this issue is not that uncommon. Other complicated situations may involve occurrences such as identity theft, where you are essentially having an individual or a group of people impersonate you. This creates an interesting situation, for does the impersonator and the person being impersonated both exist as two people? And then you have cases like the CEO of LifeLock who has had his identity stolen from him 13 times. I mean, maybe you shouldn't put your social security number on a truck and drive that around New York. And then you have Ferdinand Demara, one of the most famous impersonators of all time, even getting a movie. That proves it. He would impersonate real people and sometimes make up identities in order to gain access to particular job opportunities. Working as a psychologist, a civil engineer, a deputy, a university professor, and even a trauma surgeon. An identity he stole from somebody at a school where he was studying law pretending to be somebody else. While impersonating people, his achievements would still be credited to the people that he was impersonating. Well, until he got caught. Though Demara was able to perform successful surgeries on 16 soldiers during the Korean War with no prior training. Partly thanks to a liberal amount of penicillin. These were credited to Joseph Sear, who Demara was impersonating near Korea, despite Sear working as a trauma surgeon in Maine at the time. On a different note, in China, if you plan on being reincarnated after you die, you actually have to fill out an application and submit it to several government agencies within the nation. Something that was initially done to keep tabs on the Buddhists, but in a way it allows for a form of legal recognition concerning literally becoming another person. Certain religious laws or practices may even indicate that through conversion or practices like baptism, for instance, where you are born again, you then kind of become a new person. Finally, there's the matter of legal recognition, which may force you to identify differently than how you may identify yourself. This may include areas of the world where it is illegal for you to change your religion or even leave it, for instance, despite you have. Maybe you have to live a completely separate life in order to keep up appearances for your own protection. Not saying things and even doing things or behaving in certain ways. Places just where you're not allowed to express yourself in the way you want to express yourself. something that is not that uncommon for people who are homosexual or transgender in different parts of the world. And depending on definitions and laws, you might even be able to consider a pregnant woman literally being in a state where you are more than one person, where you could perceive the fetus as a person or even a person body part. It may work. Pregnancy might be the most literal example of someone being more than one person. The variety of different categories considering the law is enormous. This grouping is unique because we have a lot of power over it, and it'll be different depending on where you go. And of course, depending on the nation you are in, the languages you speak, what religion you may or may not believe in, you might get different answers for some of these examples. And this brings up the final category, your personal existence. Here I want to briefly discuss three major subcategories: development, realization, and brain function and health, though there are likely many more. Much like your personal existence, you could probably count the continual existence of your personality as one unit of person within itself. But seeing as how humans change, could major changes in personality within the context of characteristics and qualities be enough to identify you as a different person than you once were? Of course, some of these are rather subjective and truly depend on your own understanding of yourself. Of course, it's not like counting atoms. As we grow up, we change radically from different stages in our lives. Surely you are a different person now than you were 5, 10, 15 years ago, and at least especially when you look back at your youth. In our youth, we may find ourselves behaving, believing, and acting differently than we do as adults, though everybody is different. For some people, maybe growing up is just adding understandings and experiences to a relatively consistent personality. Maybe for some people, growing up requires a fundamental reevaluation and changing of personal behavior. Or maybe it's somehow a little bit of both, or maybe you have a completely different experience. How do you perceive yourself? And on the other hand, you may have had realizations that have completely changed your life. And this could happen at any stage in your life, really. Maybe it's adopting a religion or leaving one. Coming to terms with gender identity, sexuality, or even political beliefs. Maybe something to do with philosophy, conspiracy, or even generosity changed you. Were you involved in a traumatic event, an accident, or even assault? Maybe faced with the death of a loved one. From a different angle, what about finding a significant other or even having children? Something that genuinely changed you from there on out. A good event, a bad event, a good and bad event that maybe made you feel like a different person afterwards. How would you personally count these things, considering yourself? Finally, you also have brain health and function that can change you. You could look at the impact of substances like alcohol or marijuana or extremely hard drugs like heroin. But it doesn't have to necessarily be negative, like substances that help people deal with depression or PTSD, for instance. If you do use, could you identify that such use is something that creates almost a different you within the moment? You also have the matter of directly altering the brain through surgeries or an impact of some sort. Take the case of Rosemary Kennedy, for example, the sister of John F. Kennedy. Her father had her undergo a lobotomy at age 23 to quell her rebellious nature, among other things. It went horribly wrong, leaving her with a mental state of a 2-year-old afterwards. Having to relearn to walk and talk, she was forever changed. And then you have straight up brain injuries. Something that has not been uncommon throughout history is events like getting kicked in the head by a horse. But today we often find people getting in horrible accidents, like motorcycle accidents or even car accidents. And there are many kinds of accidents that can harm your head. And then you have natural damage that's done to the brain, which changes its function and health. Dementia and Alzheimer's being among two most well-known examples. Many times people just live in a constant state of being a shell of their former self, slowly and continually deteriorating into somebody they aren't. It's a bit of a sad note to leave things on, but I hope the examples resonate with you. When there are major changes internally, personality changes. Do the definitions around the word one and the word person justify the recognition that we exist as more than one person internally? And at the very least, potentially. I'll leave that to you. Humans are complex creatures that exist in a complicated universe. We organize the universe around us through words, units. And sometimes those units are defined in a manner that allows their definitions to be applied in unexpected ways. The word person and how it relates to personality and persona in the English language appears to me to open up this kind of discussion. But if another language was investigated, the equivalents to one and person might not include the same definitions, and subsequently bring rise to completely different discussions, potentially changing the outcomes of some of these experiences. Of course, in the case of English, it's fun to see how flexible or not our words can be. So I'll pass the question on to you, taking this video and other factors you can think of into consideration. Are you more than one person? Bonus points if you know another language and you want to see how this question would work through the framework of that language. And with all that said and done, my name's Dale, this is Think Fact, and remember, never stop learning and thinking. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It would really help me out. And feel free to check out some of my other videos. for the facts and thoughts that almost everybody missed. Have a good one.